Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Which brings us to the FTC and the sort of fake review moderation issue.
Sure.
So
let me start that.
What happened?
Finally passed a rule banning fake reviews and testimonials. Now, you have to understand the language of the FTC. There have always been guidelines which banned fake reviews and testimonials and various other behaviors. Guidelines are...
It's a technical term. Guidelines is a technical term. Yeah.
But does not give them as much enforcement capacity as a rule. A rule has the force of law. A guideline, a business you have to prove that the business is aware of the guideline, and you have to, if they aren't aware of the guideline, you have to educate them about the guideline.
Right.
So they get
give them a second chance.
Second bite at the apple, as it were, with guidelines.
Yeah.
Because the Supreme Court ruled that the FTC couldn't singularly assign a fine in the case of guidelines without going through a judicial process, the FTC decided they wanted to make it into a rule. A rule requires public hearings. They had 2 or 3. They have to publish the rule and wait for objections, whatever. Anyways, they've now finalized the rule, and the rule basically is more limited than the guideline, but it allows them to fine people $50,000 per instance of abuse. And they basically defined a number of things as abusive, reviews that are fake, that are either written by AI or written by somebody that doesn't have direct experience with the business, that are either purchased, buying reviews from customers, like giving them stuff, particularly if it has a valence to it, to give us a positive or give somebody else a negative review. That's illegal. But interestingly, and then finally, insider reviews. You can't have your aunt or your uncle or other business members.
Right. You can't operate a site that contains a bunch of, sort of have a site that sort of contains a bunch of
company-controlled review website that has fake reviews. And then you can't do review suppression, whatever.
Review gating, yeah.
Legal. Well, they don't say that. They say legal threats, physical threats, intimidation, false public accusations.
So that's an interesting question, because they came out in a big way against review gating, sort of selectively publishing reviews or sending negative reviews in one path and positive reviews in another. And does this in any way revise that, if that's not explicitly discussed?
Again, the rules and guidelines are separate. And so you can have more extensive guidelines than you have rules. So the rules are just more limited. So it does not make gating illegal. In other words, that falls under the guideline. And so one of the reasons that the FTC sent out 700 letters to review gathering companies was so that they would be on notice that review gating would be considered a violation of the guideline. So if they were caught review gating, they wouldn't get a second bite. That was their notice, right?
All right. So there's a story in the Washington Post today about how all these companies are now, the tech companies are sort of behind this FTC regulation, which is a sort of a rarity, celebrating it, and this is very supportive of it. Right.
And that's because most of the large tech companies aren't affected by it, right?
Right, of course.
This Google is protected, as you've noted, under Section 230. Does not require them to have any stronger review moderation or review procedures. And because of that, and because of the fact that most fake reviews are purchased offshore, it's going to be very difficult to enforce this. Now, one of the things they said in this was that if a business should have been reasonably aware that the reviews accruing to their business were fake, then they are still liable. So they have expanded sort of the definition. In other words, a business
imputed knowledge.
Imputed knowledge is now a reason to be considered guilty.
If you can infer from the circumstances, if there was something fishy going on, and you should have been able to infer from the circumstances that it was not kosher, so to speak, then
Correct.
you can be stuck with the liability.
So even if a marketing manager that you didn't know was doing this
Right.
somehow secretly engaged a Ukrainian company to leave fake reviews, if they're popping up, you're still probably
Well, it's sort of case by case. You have to prove it based on the facts of this case.
right. But
So
so the reason the tech companies are happy is because now there are legal grounds to go after people who buy and sell reviews and businesses who procure fake reviews.
well, so let's
And also we haven't mentioned this, but say fake social profiles. It's illegal to buy fake social likes. Or
any sort of
followers.
false representation of advocacy, around businesses.
Right. Yes.
So let's talk about the impact of this. So there are sort of arguably four populations here. There's the tech platforms, Google, Yelp, TripAdvisor, etc. There's the businesses themselves. There's business competitors, which is a sort of a, because they get involved in fake review generation to some degree. So the businesses, which includes the business and its competitors, and then so it's three populations really. And then the third one is the fake review ecosystem, the people in the offshore environments that are generating these.
And then the fifth one is companies who help businesses get reviews. Right.
Okay, so right. So the review, the reputation, the sort of unethical reputation management companies, sort of smaller players that are operating in some gray area or black hat. So, as you said, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act protects Google, Yelp, TripAdvisor et al. Inoculates them from any liability for content that appears on their site. So they have no liability. There are no consequences for them if they're riddled with fake reviews.
This allows them to go after people they've determined that are doing this at scale with a legal cudgel, right? So they can, I think.
Well, that's a big question. So, what does enforcement on the ground look like? Because as we've discussed in the past, the FTC has very limited resources. They're involved in a lot of things. It's a small group. Belina Khan has talked about this, publicly about the sort of their enforcement capabilities limited by their resources. So we're not going to see. This is not like the police that are going to investigate every instance of a review fraud situation. This is going to be a handful of very high profile cases in the hope of creating deterrence among sort of businesses at large.
Correct, but with a significant fine of $50,000 per instance, which I take to mean per fake review. So
if you're somebody, per fake review, 50K.
Mm-hmm.
So that's meaningful. If you've got, if you're a big company that has been enlisting internal employees to fabricate reviews for whatever purpose, consumer persuasion or ranking or both, that's meaningful, right? So that's meaningful. But for everybody above below the radar, which is most of the businesses probably that are engaged in some sort of review, dubious review solicitation or outright fraud, there's going to be no consequences in all likelihood. I mean, what remains to be seen.
Right.
But I mean, Google has not been good to focus on them. Google has not been good about their own enforcement, right? The hacking illustration just a few minutes ago. So what mechanism, and we've talked about layoffs at Google Local, so what mechanism are they going to use to do this enforcement at the behest of the, sort of with the FTC in the background? Are they going to change anything? Are they going to be more diligent?
I think they're like the FTC are only going to go after the most egregious offenders, right. not the average.
Well, it's like the PR thing. When something rises to the level of high level public visibility in a national publication that makes Google look bad, they take action.
Right, and their algorithm does take action a lot wrongly, and they've made that very difficult now with some recent changes to dispute. So if you're in a home service business, you're likely not getting as many reviews as are being left. Google's filtering them, and they've made it very difficult to get those back. So Google can still claim they filtered 25 gazillion reviews, but they may or may not be justified. So
Yeah.
Google is not going to do much. They might, again, like the FTC, go after big offenders. One of the things that bothers me about this, though, is the fact that incentives are still not illegal. They're still allowed, both under the guidelines and here. It's a very subtle distinction. Here,
Oh, it's
not.
meaningful. It's meaningful.
Here, it's only illegal if the incentive is predicated on a rating. But under the guideline,
wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Right, but under the guideline, you have to explicitly express that it was incentivized, which creates this very weird conflict because Google doesn't allow them because there's no way to note them being incentivized. Yelp doesn't allow them. So if you then incentivize reviews for Google, it's technically a violation of the guideline. The guideline is probably going to be enforced even less than the rule now, because the rule is the easier thing to enforce. So I see a problem with people misunderstanding and continuing to do inappropriate incentives for Google and Yelp reviews.
Well, I mean, there's sort of the innocent violator who just doesn't really know what the rules are and can say, we'll give you a free cup of coffee if you leave a review, and that may be entirely.
Well, if it's a rule, you have to say free cup of coffee if you leave a positive review. If it's under the guideline, you just have to.
Yeah, but I mean,
you gave them a free cup of coffee.
My point is that there are people that don't know the intricacies of these rules, right. and they're not bad actors, right? And then there's a bunch of people who are going to take advantage, and wink, wink. You know what this is about. Give us a review, and whatever the quid pro quo is. So I think this is good. Just to summarize, I think this is obviously a very good development. However, the absence of any consequences for the platforms that encourage more aggressive moderation is problematic, and the inability to get at the review farms offshore is also quite problematic. The DSA in Europe, the Digital Services Act, does preclude the platforms from, I don't know what the precise situation is, but that's about content moderation, broader than reviews, obviously.
Well, but in reviews, we have an interesting case study in reviews where Google has this bug now. When they suspend a business, they often lose the reviews. They used to be able to find, when the business is determined to be legitimate, reinstated. Historically, Google was able to reassociate the reviews with the business, but
the CID or whatever it is.
Well, they end up with a new one. And they could find the reviews. Now they can't. Now, interestingly, in Europe, you can file a mediation request to get those reviews back. And in the one case I saw, when a business did file a mediation request, Google, instead of going through all the legal rigmarole, managed to find the reviews.
Which means they can.
Which means they can, but it means that they don't have an easy app to do it or an easy interface to do it, which means that support people can't. It takes an engineer. And so currently, those reviews that have been missing for these businesses have been missing for 6 or 8 months in some cases. And Google has no ability to seem to have no ability to find the reviews or get them back easily or whatever. So there is a difference in outcome because of the DSA. As far as I'm
concerned. And in general, there is no Section 230 in Europe, and so the platforms can't hide behind this sort of legal immunity. And at a certain level of visibility, I mean, I'm sure the European Commission won't go after the platforms for isolated instances of fraud, but there may be some things that rise to some level of enforcement, but we'll see. But the larger point is that the DSA is supposed to preclude large-scale review fraud, and there's no kind of corresponding Section 230 to protect platforms against exposure in that situation. We've already seen in certain instances the sort of impact of that on the U.S. market, just because Google is trying to play globally and doesn't want to have different systems in different situations.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.